Good morning and welcome to this Hudson Institute event on Mexico's new political landscape. My name is Dan Battier and I'm an adjunct fellow at Hudson. Our guest today is Luis Rubio. Luis is chairman of the Mexican think tank México Evalúa. He has written numerous highly regarded books. He is a columnist for the daily newspaper Reforma. And Luis is an old friend of Hudson Institute, so I'm very pleased to have him here today. Luis, welcome back to Hudson Institute.
Thank you very much.
President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum won election with a very strong mandate, but faces some unique challenges in leading Mexico. Among them, dealing with the influence of outgoing President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Luis, can you describe the political situation in Mexico and discuss how Claudia Sheinbaum might govern?
That's a broad question. Let me give you sort of my 10 cents, not 2 cents, of where I see Mexico today. I think that the election was pretty paradoxical in its result because it was an extraordinary win for the governing party, but by the same token, it didn't provide an obvious path to governing, and this is a paradox. I think this sort of summarizes the conundrum in which Mexico finds itself, because even though, of course, there's no argument about the actual result, there are plenty questions about how Mexico will be governing itself in the future. There are structural problems and there are specific problems about the current moment. There are, of course, a lot of questions about what went wrong for the opposition, a question that should be raised and should be asked. There are also questions about whether there were any shenanigans played by the governing party, which surely there were. I don't think that would have altered the result. But the really important thing to keep in mind is that this election was a referendum on the president more than anything else. It was he who was the actual candidate, the de facto candidate. It was an election in which the strategy of the winning candidate, of Claudia Sheinbaum, was to maximize his presence and minimize herself. In that regard, the election was very, again, paradoxical. If one looks at the way that Mexico has been working and operating for the last 5 years during this administration, 5.5 years, it's pretty clear that the president had as his, I wouldn't say sole, but almost sole objective to win this election from the very beginning. He did very little else other than to build the constituency and the capacity for winning this election. This ties in with the way Mexico's old political system, 20th century political system worked, in which the performance of a president was frequently judged by the result of the election of the successor. In that regard, it was very, very similar to the old system, except that this is not the old system. And that's the point that I would like to really make today. The first important thing about the question that you raise is that the way the president-elect, the virtual president-elect, because legally she's not the president-elect, the way she's behaving, the way she's acting is not what one would expect with such an enormous win. Rather than picking up and organizing her team to launch her new government come October 1st, she's been consulting him all the time. She's been visiting different places around the country with him, something that has never happened in Mexican history in the past. And above all, she's been, at least publicly, advocating for the legislative agenda, which is an extraordinarily ambitious agenda for the month of September, which is the only month in which the new Congress and Senate will coincide with the last month of the current president. There's a reason why she's behaving this way. And that reason, or at least there's a potential reason for that. And that is, on the one hand, and obviously because it was his election, and therefore he remains very strong. Even though in US parlance he would be a lame dog at this stage, and that's what Mexican presidents have been in the past. More importantly, the body that has to certify her election, the Electoral Tribunal, is short one person. It should have 5 magistrates. It should have 7. It only has 5, and 6 are needed to certify the election. And there's no 6th because he has made it possible for the 6th not to be ratified by the Senate. So this may be a strategy. It may not be. But the point is that he holds the cards. So she will not be a president-elect until he actually decides that she become a president. There's the time limit for that is September 6th. That's once the new Congress is in place. It's not related to the Congress itself, but it's on the 6th of September. So from here to September 6th, she's still going to be a virtual president-elect, not a real president-elect. And this takes me to the broader issue of power in Mexican society. She has, as I mentioned, blindly endorsed his agenda. The first question is whether she actually believes in it. It's impossible to tell. She grew up politically under his wing for the last 25 years. And she's been mimicking him since then. So it's impossible to tell for outsiders, what exactly she thinks and what she wants to accomplish. But the one thing that we do know is that she faces, and she will face, a completely different scenario. She would face a reality that is altogether different. First, there's a major fiscal issue, even though the president tried to maintain healthy public finances. This year, 2024, there's a deficit of 6.5% of GDP. That's humongous for a country like Mexico. Only countries like the US, which print dollars, can get away with something like that. Countries like Mexico and the whole region, if one looks at that, and then the whole South in general, cannot play those kinds of games. So she'll have to deal with that enormous gap there. Second, he rode the extraordinary ride of the US economy for the last several years, because the main engine of growth of Mexico's economy is exports to the US. So if there is any reduction in the growth of the US, that will affect both remittances as well as exports, both of which are critical to stability and growth in Mexico. But the most important thing is that she's not him. He's not repeatable. He's a unique figure in Mexican politics. He has an extraordinary personal history, and he built an enormous constituency, which is what explains the result of the election. And nobody can imitate that, at least not today. She may grow to be that or similarly, but that's not who she is today. I don't have the slightest doubt that she'll be able to develop the skills necessary to run a government. She's proven to be very capable as Mexico City mayor, but that's not the same as running a complex country, which is a totally different scale. So the first question is whether she realizes that she will need to shift course on a series of key issues. And then second question is whether she can do it. There are some critical appointments that have to be made. The circumstances have forced her to announce the members of the cabinet, and she's been doing that piecemeal. She presented the first batch last week, 6 people. She's supposed to do the same next Thursday, tomorrow, another batch. most members of the cabinet, as in every country, are of different levels of relevance and transcendence. Some are absolutely critical, and most can be replaced if need be, but some of them cannot be, and that's true for not only for members of the cabinet, but it's also true of decisions, critical decisions, particularly on the legislative side. My point is simply that there are some things that are not reversible. If she decides to make appointments on individuals that cannot be replaced, or which she has no power to replace, for example, or on major reforms, particularly constitutional reforms, that then cannot be reversed, those things become, and those appointments or reforms are not, have not been promoted by her, but they are promoted by somebody else, in this case, the outgoing president, then she's stuck with them, and that could determine the outcome of her own government. But there's a broader issue which I would like to address, which is the complexity of the Mexican political structure, of Mexican institutions. Mexico is, by structure, a federal country, and the reason for that is that the first constitution of Mexico, 1824, was inspired by the U.S. Constitution. But the reality is that Mexico has always been a centralized political system. We do have branches of government exactly the same as the U.S., the Congress, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court and the like, again, because it was copied from the U.S. Structure. But the key difference is that those never functioned very well, and the executive always dominated the other branches of government. What kept the country working was a political party that was created in 1928 and which conveyed stability and continuity to the political system. It was the PRI and its two predecessors, but the idea was that was an institution that replaced the lack of other institutions, and that made Mexico very different from most of the rest of Latin America, in that there were no military coups, in that there was continuity. When there was a messy government, the party had the power and the strength to correct course and go back to stability. The PRI began to weaken over the years, simply because it was very successful, because it produced economic growth, because it produced a middle class, because the society, or the urban society, grew significantly, because there were political claims against the system by those that benefited from it over the decades. New generations came about, and so on and so forth. The other thing that happened was that as Mexico's economy began to face the new realities of the world, technological change and the like, in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, it began to liberalize its economy, and that again weakened the traditional structures, as it has happened in the rest of the world. The point is that the PRI began to weaken until it lost power in 2000, and that did away with that institution and the function it served. This was supposed to be replaced by democracy and democratic institutions, and Mexico developed an independent Supreme Court, an independent central bank, institutions for freedom of information and transparency, institutions for regulatory institutions for energy, for competition, for any number of other things. Then López Obrador came in, and he found that all those institutions were a hindrance to executive power, and he neutralized most of them. He eliminated some of them. He's now challenging the electoral institutions and the Supreme Court. Those are two of the reforms that he wants to have passed come September. The point is that he wants to go back to centralizing power. It was the power and of his own personality that kept things going during the last several years. It was the power of his own political ability that made it possible to keep things going. But that, in his absence, once the new government is in place, the question is, what happens now? The PRI is no longer there. and I'm not suggesting that one should come back or that was a good era. It was simply a fact of Mexican reality. The democratic institutions are no longer in place or are very weakened. So the question is, how does the new president operate and govern in those circumstances? So as I see things evolving in the next several months, I'd say three things, and with that I'll stop. One is that a critical thing is for the next several months will be the relationship between these two individuals, the outgoing president and the new one. I have absolutely no doubt that she will get rid of him, and that's not because she likes him or dislikes him. It's because of the reality of power demands that, and that has happened every single time there's a transition of power. This is somewhat unique because he was the major player in this election. But of all the presidents I've known personally or observed personally, and those that I've studied historically, every one of them or most of them tried to manipulate their successors, and none was able to do it. One president sent his predecessor as ambassador to Fiji because that was the furthest place he could find. Another jailed the brother because he was on corruption charges, and that did away with the predecessor, and on and on. That has happened one time after another, and I have no doubt that will happen. Whether that happens 5 minutes after she takes over, or a year after she takes over, that's another story. The question, and this I'm repeating here, is what happens with those decisions that are not reversible, that have already been made by them. The second question is, how flexible will she be in trying to adapt herself to whatever realities she finds that do not match her preconceptions, which is human. We all come to a new position and we assume things that are not necessarily the ones that we expected. There's no question in my mind that she's extremely competent. She proved to be a very effective mayor. Her cabinet at the Mexico City level, which is a 20 million people government, not a minor place, was far more technically competent than the president's cabinet. She will make decisions on the basis of information or analysis, not of political gut, the way the president did it. So if I were to speculate, I don't think it's difficult to fathom a scenario in which she ends up coming to realize several things. First, that she needs to get rid of him because he's not helping, even though she remains loyal to him in her deepest sentiments. Two, she'll build a structure to contain the worst and most extreme elements within Morena, because Morena is not a political party, it's a movement, whatever that means. But the point of a movement is that it doesn't have disciplinary structures, mechanisms to control the structures. The only thing that keeps Morena together is the president. So once he's out, that's a major challenge, not a small one. And I dare say something else. Such a big win is not good for her because it emboldens the most radical and the most extreme elements in the party, on both ends of the party. She will also, and the one thing where she's absolutely different from him is that she understands full well that economic growth is necessary for the country to develop. The president preferred not to advocate for more investment or for attract private investment. She understands that that's absolutely necessary. So she'll have to find ways to attract investors, and some of the reforms that are proposed go counter to what investors required as a certainty for them to be willing to take the risk of investing. And she will need to retain or regain legitimacy for herself and her government, which is, again, no mean feat. If one there was this Max Weber who talked about three ways in which leadership works. One is charismatic, one is traditional, and the other is institutional. The president has run the country based on his charisma. There is no traditional kind of government, monarchy, for example, in Mexico. So I don't think she has a choice but to try to start rebuilding institutions, maybe better institutions, maybe more longer-lasting institutions than the ones we had before. But I don't think she has anything, she has the slightest possibility of being successful unless she begins to develop or strengthen or recreate institutions that will allow her to function. So I do not see any cataclysmic moment, but I do see enormous challenges looking forward.
Thank you. I think you've hit on the central question for many people, which is, are the things that might happen before she takes office irreversible? Among those are the package of reforms known as Plan C. Could you talk about what is driving this sort of rushed attempt to pass these, very significant reforms?
It is there's something very odd in those reforms, because the president had qualified majority in the lower house of Congress during the first 3 years of his administration, and he was short, if I'm not wrong, 9 members in the Senate. But again, he proved that he was capable of buying out whomever he needed by all the tricks that Congresses play in order to pass legislation that they need. Nothing necessarily improper or corrupt, and he didn't pass those legislations. And that's the oddity. Why didn't he advance them when he had all the power to do so? My guess is that he assumed that he would be there forever, as many presidents believe that once they are in office, they can go on getting away with anything. He also realized earlier than most people that it would be a big win for his party, and more important, he's a person of the 20th century. One has to understand him in terms of where he comes from. He was the leader of the governing party then in the 1970s in his home state of Tabasco. It was a time in which money was flowing everywhere because of the recently developed oil wealth in his home state of Tabasco. So he learned to play politics by giving away money because he had plenty of money to give away. He also saw Pemex, the oil company, as the main factor of demand, the main factor of creation of wealth, because they were buying endless number of tons of cement, steel, pipes, whatever oil companies require, and a central government that could get things done without having to ask anyone or be accountable to anyone. So that very simplistic view of the world is what he's trying to recreate, and all those things that were obstacles to that centralized control of power is what he has attempted to eliminate during his administration. At the beginning of the last year of his administration, on the 5th of February, the anniversary of the Constitution, he came up with this list of 20 pieces of legislation, 18 of which are constitutional amendments, which include some very nasty stuff as well as very transcendent stuff. But the two key pieces are for Mexicans first, and second for foreigners. For Mexicans, the key piece is that he wants, for all practical purposes, to dismantle the electoral institutions. The electoral institutions are critical for a very simple reason, because in the years of the PRI, there was often manipulation of the voting process, and it was all under the wing of the government. He wants to bring that back to the government. it's paradoxical that after such a humongous election and a successful election, with independent institutions and fundamentally clean in every respect. I think there are 2 or 3 districts that may be at issue, but they were fundamentally clean and nobody serious is quarreling with the result, not the overall result. That he wants to bring that down. The other is that he wants to have the judicial reform, which Mexico badly needs because justice is not exactly available to most Mexicans. But the way he wants it is by replacing all the judges in the country, all federal judges at every level, including the Supreme Court, and the new ones being appointed by election, popular election, something that almost no country in the world has done. The U.S. has at the state level some judges that are elected, some that are appointed, but no Supreme Court other than Bolivia has Supreme Court judges elected. So that's the most damaging one because once that's done, then it becomes very difficult to go back. The main issue in my mind, however, is that even if this election is not passed, in Mexico, justices of the Supreme Court are appointed for 15 years. So 4 members of the court are going to be replaced in the next 3 years, the first one of which is going to be replaced at the end of this year. So they will already have, the Morena, the governing party will already have control of the court for constitutional purposes as of January 1st of next year. So there's a lot of hoopla around this, even though the most fundamental issues are going to change anyway.
So many observers are comparing one of the possible scenario with a reversion to Mexico's one-party past. Is that an apt comparison, or do you see differences between between the system Mexico has had for many years and what's coming?
Well, I think that there's no question that is the objective. The problem is that the reality doesn't allow that. The reason why the old system collapsed, among others, is because the government could control economic decisions. It controlled the way the private sector organized. It controlled through permit requirements, exports, imports, investments, and the like. None of that exists, and none of that is possible unless Mexico destroys the main source of economic growth, which is USMCA. Going back in history in the political side is possible, theoretically, but that would kill the hen that lays the golden eggs, as the saying goes. But more important is that the opposition is in disarray, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be in disarray permanently. I think that there are some structural issues like political parties maintained by the government, which is not a good idea, which provides horrendous incentives for the leadership of the parties. But nonetheless, those things can be fixed, and I don't believe that it's obvious that this next administration is going to be that successful. It may be, and I hope it is, but it may not be, and that opens up the possibility for a different governing structure come 2030. So I think that that's the risk, but I don't think it's a certainty.
Mm-hmm. Given that the President López Obrador is trying to concentrate power and remove checks on power, do you think that the calculus behind this series of reforms is not just that he's willing to accept the consequences that this will have for investment from the U.S. and abroad, but that's the point, that he wants to remove the United States and the markets as a check on presidential power?
There's absolutely no question about that. The problem is that it's impossible. How do you separate? How do you remove? I mean, how do you change geography first, and how do you do away with the factor that makes it possible for the economy to grow, which is the United States? So I'd go one step further. The whole point of NAFTA in the 1990s was to make sure that nobody would change that course by having the U.S. be part of the deal. And then President George H.W. Bush understood full well the geopolitical implications of this, and that's why he went for it.
So, given some of the constraints on that Sheinbaum will have on her power once she takes office, what do you see as the areas where she might begin to try to establish independence, where she might try to advance her own agenda?
Well, there are some areas in which she clearly doesn't coincide with him. The few that are public during the pandemic, for example, she did not go for the same health rulings that the federal government was pursuing. She also did not follow the security protocols that the president had for the rest of the country, so-called hugs, not bullets. And she had a fairly, compared to the rest of the country, a very successful security strategy. Not extraordinary by absolute standards, but much better than the rest of the country. So I think she would be first. She would be attempting to bring private investment in much bigger ways. She'll try to find ways she won't have a single penny, so she'll have to find ways for infrastructure to be financed, at least, if not built, by private contractors. She has a completely different view on energy. She understands that Pemex is no longer, that hydrocarbons in general are no longer the solution, and Pemex is just a drain on government resources. So she'll want to have much bigger and faster investments in clean energies. So there are some functional areas in which she'll be very different. She also understands that most Mexicans are extremely concerned about security. That's the one thing in which everybody agrees on. So that will require a new strategy, and the military is a means, not a solution. She's already begun to point in that direction. The question is, in my mind, is whether she can establish her authority over the governing structures and over Morena on the one hand, and two, whether she begins to develop institutional mechanisms that avoid challenges to her government to begin with. And being a woman is going to be a big challenge simply because she's a woman in a macho country. And women in general tend to face challenges that men don't, but by the sole fact that they are women. So it's a combination of circumstances.
You mentioned that everyone is agreed on security, but the opposition candidate tried to make security and violence the central issue of the campaign, yet didn't seem to get traction. It certainly didn't shift the election for her. Do you see a consensus on that and room for Sheinbaum to act on that?
I think that there are two different answers to that. One is that the opposition candidate tried to make it an issue, but she never proposed a solution. So there was nothing to hang on to very specific. If she had won, she would not have had a mandate on that because she never proposed an actual policy to deal with the issue. She tried to turn the issue in itself, and that wasn't enough. The other is that what led to the big win was a combination of a very successful management of emotions by the president through 5 years of daily rants on television. There was a company that has presence throughout the country. They made a poll among their own staff, and they could repeat the phrases that the president used systematically. So he was a hugely successful communicator. The other is that that incomes and consumption increased significantly in the last 4 years, and that was partly due to remittances and economic growth in general. And he benefited from 30 years of reforms that he was against throughout that period. But the other is that his government did promote an increase in the minimum wages, I think by almost 150%, and those things did help people get much better living standards in a very short time. Whether that's sustainable is a different question. Politically, that had an enormous effect.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up for a minute about the opposition. You've said that in spite of this huge defeat, they could still be relevant. It seems like there may be an attempt to sort of reform the PRI. That so far there aren't signs that the PAN is changing leadership or anything. Given the election results, do you think they should be looking at major shifts in their leadership and in how they go about doing politics?
Those are I think the quick questions for the future. The PRI has already announced that they will not change leadership. PAN will have to change simply because their statutes demand that. And the president of PAN cannot change the statutes as the president of PRI has, to his benefit. But I'm not saying that what I'm saying is that if they get their act together, they could have a chance to govern in the future. Nothing more than that. But it's only a chance, not more. They would have to restructure themselves. They would have to become much closer to the people. One of the reforms that are being proposed is to eliminate re-election of members of Congress, which I think would not change much, but it's been only in place for about 10 years or 12 years now. But that diminishes the capacity to govern because we always have new members of Congress that don't have a history, do not have they did not develop skills to govern and to be legislators. So until Mexico's political class professionalizes itself, that's not going to work well, and that's true for every party, not only for the opposition. I don't think I certainly don't have an answer of how the opposition can restructure itself, but I don't think anyone has. But I think that's going to be key to the future. If they cannot propose something better, and they can only come up with a candidate that has some charisma but not much content, as it happened here, then that's not going to make it. Mm-hmm.
There's been a gradual deterioration of the civic space in Mexico. Violence surrounding elections, attacks on journalists. You mentioned the daily presidential news conferences that have served to really manipulate the information space. Do you see this continuing under Sheinbaum, or do you think she might change the tone a little bit?
I have no doubt that she'll change the tone. She's already changed the tone. She's being much more conciliatory. She's not being polarizing. She's trying to. She's been very strong in that she'll be the president of all Mexicans, not just of those who voted for her. So in that regard, it's going to be a very different tone. Also, I'm not sure that she has the skills to be able to play the same game that he had. And again, he was a very unique figure in that regard, as people of his ilk tend to be, and we have we can see them throughout the world, including the U.S. She'll have to develop her own way of being effective and being perceived as effective and legitimate. I think it will be welcome for her not to be that rhetorical and that polarizing. But I'm also speaking about from the vantage point of those who have been on the receiving end. So the point, I think, is that she realizes that she cannot play the same game on the one hand, and on the other that Mexico needs something different.
Mm-hmm. The Biden administration has been pretty quiet about the about the erosion of democratic institutions in Mexico, and it seems like President López Obrador has sort of taken that as a sign to do what he wants. How do you think Sheinbaum will interpret that, or do you see any changes in that?
That's a great question. Historically, when the U.S. government uttered the word, Mexicans united against the U.S. So the U.S. is playing the opposite. Let's not become a unifying factor against us. The other, for the first time in a long time, many Mexicans are asking, where's the U.S. when we need them? Mm-hmm. I think that President Biden has been playing the right strategy, being cautious, being much more effective in private than in public. My guess is that that's not necessarily going to be true with President Sheinbaum than it was with López Obrador, who was much more explosive and mercurial in his way of being. But when Trump threatened to link migration to exports, Mexican exports or U.S. imports, he reacted and he responded instantly the way Trump wanted. But the other side of the equation is that the U.S. has in the Mexico-U.S. border an enormously complicated situation domestically. Mexico is part of the U.S. Presidential debate, and it's going to be an issue tonight, and it's going to be an issue for the remainder 5 months or whatever from here to November. Increasing the rhetorical level is not helpful to anyone.
Mm-hmm. I think everyone who follows bilateral relations agrees that just given the range of bilateral issues at play and the stakes involved, that the United States and Mexico need to work much more closely on a range of issues. But that's much easier said than done. Do you see any changes with that in a Sheinbaum administration?
I think there's going to be I don't think that it's easy to answer that question today because, well, at least I don't think we know, but certainly I don't know what she thinks of the U.S. She comes from the much harder left that does not like to work with the U.S. However, she did work with U.S. government agencies in Mexico City as mayor. In general, Mexico's political class was deeply anti-American historically, and then it realized that geopolitically Mexico is part of the U.S. sphere of influence, and that will never change. So what happened in the 1990s or late 80s was that Mexico decided that it was better to turn that into an advantage rather than to a permanent source of conflict. And I think in general, Mexico's political class learned that that was the only way to go. But we've never had a president that comes from the hard left. I think the question is how pragmatic will she be in that regard and how ideological she is. I don't think she's too ideological, but I don't know. I don't know how to answer that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. We have a little bit of time for questions from the audience, so I'd like to open it up to the audience, and we have a question in the back.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in DC. One question. I read that Morena now controls between 23 and 24 of the governors of Mexico after the recent elections. That means they control, like, I think, like 3/4 now from all Mexican states. Can you just talk about what was the relationship between President AMLO with the governors during his presidency, and what can you expect during the new with President-elect Sheinbaum's relationship with the governors, especially when most of them will come from her own party? Thank you.
Well, the governors are ultimately dependent on the central government for the reason that most of their budgets come from the federal government. And that was purposeful. That was part of the deal under very centralized governments during the 20th century. They have very few sources of revenue at the state level, and many of them prefer to go beg the federal government than have to be accountable to their local citizens. So the government, that gives enormous power to the federal government and to the president himself. So he played the governors any way he wanted. Even with the opposition, he blackmailed many of them and rewarded them with embassies if they lost elections. We have that in the consulate of Barcelona. We have that in the embassy in Madrid. 3 or 4 that are hoping are now members of Congress from Morena. All these are from PRI. So those arrangements were made all over the place, meaning that the president had enormous sway over the governors. The governors also are important because constitutional amendments require 16 states to ratify whatever constitutional amendments, and most of the governors control their legislative bodies. So that's another reason why it's important. So for her, maintaining closeness with the governors is fundamental, and that means not only the governors, but that also means Morena in general. That's one of the serious tests of her ability to govern that will come very soon.
Please.
Hello, thank you for your time. I had a quick question about your discussion of the 3 branches and the checks and balances and the disruption and predominance of the executive branch. What we see oftentimes is the checks and balances work only so long as there's a strong trust in the institution and respect for the checks themselves within the branches. Do you see in just public sentiment and even among representatives in the other branches apart from the executive, is there a dwindling trust within the system or the institution that's causing that predominance of the executive branch?
Well, you're touching on the key issue. The one body that does enjoy enormous trust was the Supreme Court. But the president disliked that the Supreme Court served as a check on the president's power, and it brought down 3 or 4 constitutional amendments and a couple of laws, particularly on energy, that he wanted passed. So the motivation, at least from my vantage point of this reform, is mostly is revenge against that body of government. But you're right in that without trust that doesn't work, and as long as those bodies are perceived to be controlled by the president, they don't serve that purpose. There will always be people who, Mexicans have a very odd way of looking at this because on the one hand they want the government not to be too powerful, and then they have now voted for an extremely strong government. For the last 20 years before this, from 1997 to 2018, Mexicans voted for separate government. They voted for Congress for one party and for the presidency for another party. And that was true even though parties for the first time in history shifted in the presidency. So now they have decided to give the president full power.
Dr. Rubio, thank you so much for coming and for your time. I wanted to ask you, it has become more evident in recent years that Morena is a party for deserters of the PRI. López Obrador himself used to be in the PRI, and more recently Del Moral from the state of Mexico just joined. And I also like that you mentioned that Sheinbaum wants to be a president of the people, not just those who voted for her. So with all of those people coming in from PRI and PAN, do you think that there is a chance that Morena is going to become a little more balanced in its policies, given the influence of new candidates from different parties?
That's a great hypothesis. Morena did not come from PRI directly. Morena is a spin-off from PRD, and PRD was founded by the conjunction of two very disparate forces. One was from the 70s or late 60s on till the end of the 80s. The leftist parties began to coalesce in order to become a single force, but coalescing among the left was complicated. Just to give an obvious example, there was a Communist Party and there was a Trotskyite Party. And they had a little history going back to the Russian Revolution. And they coalesced little by little to create a leftist party. When Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and company left the PRI because they disliked the liberalization of the economy that was being promoted by President first de la Madrid and then Salinas, they quit the PRI. So it was the left of PRI that quit, López Obrador being one of the younger types in that group, and they joined the PMS, which was the party of the left, and they created PRD. So when López Obrador decided that he didn't want to remain in PRD, and for whatever reasons we could talk about them, but that's another story, he founded Morena, which brings in people from PRD, from all the various tribes, as they themselves call them, from the left, from former PRI, and from other walks of life. The movement that was created, I think, 2016, included people from the wealthiest parts of Mexico to the poorest parts of Mexico. It had people that came from the left and the right, people that came from government and people came from the opposition, people that came from the traditional political parties and from the opposition parties. People that were guerrillas, had been guerrillas, some believe that they still are, and everything. So the problem of Morena is not who joins the party. The problem of Morena is that it doesn't have structures to organize itself and to work on its own. In the absence of López Obrador, it's going to be very messy. If PRI had anything, it was an enormously powerful structure that maintained and controlled people inside and exerted discipline. Think why President Biden became the candidate in 2020. And part of the reason was that the powers that be in the Democratic Party had the power to reach deals so that Bernie Sanders, who they believed couldn't win the election, would be replaced by somebody who could win the election. That's the way political parties operate. That in Mexico, only López Obrador can play in Morena. Nobody else can today. I don't know, 2 years hence. But obviously the idea is to turn Morena into the new governing party, and the idea is for that to be forever. I don't think it has what it takes for that to happen, but time will tell. But it's a great idea, an interesting idea to work on.
So my last question, given the paradoxical situation you've described of seemingly unprecedented power, but serious constraints on incoming president, what are the signs that we should be looking for about how she is going to govern if she is going to if she's going to signify a break from López Obrador.
Well, the first thing we'll have to see is what happens in September. That's going to be the first big test, and an obvious one. It's going to be public. The second will be some of the remaining appointments. There are some important appointments. The one that is most important, not because it's the most important, because it's the only one that is not replaceable, is defense, particularly because the military has become so active and so important in all walks of life in the last 5.5 years. Mm-hmm. So what happens to that, who that individual is, and more important, what the agenda that she wants him, I don't think there's a her there, mm-hmm. but whoever is secretary to pursue it. So that's going to be fundamental. And then her rhetoric, if she retains that conciliatory rhetoric, if she tries to entice private investors, if she talks nice to the opposition, and all those will be signs of where she's trying to go, and how realistic she is about the complexity of the moment she has before her.
Okay. Related to the appointment of a Secretary of Defense, it seems likely that the National Guard will be put under the authority of the Department of Defense. That would be another of the things that would be very difficult for her to reverse, I imagine.
She's already endorsed that idea. Mm-hmm. I think that that's been a world of make-believe. They are military. They circulate from the National Guard to the military and come back. They change their uniforms and become one or the other. I think that they should be there simply because that's the way that should be. Because they are military, not because I think Mexico needs a proper police force from the bottom up, not from the top down. I think that the National Guard and the military could help pacify territories, but what will change Mexican structure of security is developing proper police authority and judiciary at the local level, and from there up. There is not a single society in the world that works in terms of security that doesn't have that. It cannot be imposed from above. So I think that the idea of having the National Guard play that role of pacification and then and helping develop a proper structure underneath is what should happen. And if that works, over the next couple of decades, they could simply wither away. I think that's the other. What we have today is total make-believe. It's not real.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. No, this has been a very edifying discussion. Really appreciate your insights and just bringing your deep understanding of Mexico to our conversation today. Thank you to our audience and to everyone who's watching online.
Thank you.